Hi, this is the Landscape Ontario podcast. My name is Scott Barber. In this episode, we are diving into the legality surrounding COVID-19 vaccination for employers with Sebastian Huard and Alanna Twohey. They are employment lawyers with Emond, Harnden Labor and Employment Law. Can an employer make it mandatory for employees to be vaccinated against COVID-19? Can it be a factor when an employer is hiring new staff? We're going to cover those issues and more. Also, Alanna and Sebastian, they wrote an article on this subject in the July-August issue of Landscape Ontario magazine. You can check that out both in print or online at horttrades.com. But first, we hope you're going to enjoy this conversation on a very important subject. So let's start with the big sort of overview question, which is, whether an employer can, require an employee be vaccinated against COVID-19.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, there's certainly no easy answer to that question. Neither the federal government nor the provincial government or any municipal government has mandated COVID-19 vaccination, and it appears unlikely that they will. The answer will likely change as more information becomes available regarding how COVID-19 vaccines work and their efficacy. For example, do vaccinations prevent only the individual from getting sick, or do they also effectively prevent that individual from transmitting COVID-19 to others? And so for now, however, in most workplaces, enforcing a mandatory vaccination requirement is going to be an uphill battle. However, employer encouragement and support may go a long way towards ensuring employees get vaccinated, though being as likely as the mandated policy to attract judicial or arbitral scrutiny for those members that are unionized. And this may be especially true given that Canada's vaccine hesitancy rate has been low.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what are the laws or the legislations that would limit that are sort of playing into that, as you said, that uphill battle? What are the elements of the laws at play that limit, an employer's ability to mandate immunization?
Well, first we have occupational health and safety law, which at first glance would suggest that employers actually probably should mandate vaccination because they have an obligation to take every reasonable precaution to keep workers safe in the workplace. But there's two major legal concepts that run up against that. So the first would be human rights law. And you may find as an employer that there's certain employees in the workforce that can't be vaccinated. So for them, it's not a choice, it's a can't, whether that's because of a medical condition, which would be a disability, or perhaps because of their religion. And so if they can't become vaccinated based on a ground that's protected by human rights legislation, and you have a workplace policy that mandates that they must be vaccinated, you're looking at a human rights issue. And then I think the second other legal concept that really is a hurdle for mandatory vaccination is just employee privacy rights. So most employees in Ontario aren't covered by a particular piece of privacy legislation, but there's still a general right to privacy and security of the person. And so if what you're trying to do as an employer is mandate that employees get a particular medical procedure, which is really what a vaccination is, then that's infringing potentially on that right to privacy and security of the person. And so what that all boils down to is if you do try to mandate vaccination for your workplace, the potential for human rights claims is pretty high. If you have a unionized workforce, you're looking at potential grievances. And even if you don't have a unionized workforce, you have employees who you're saying either get vaccinated or you can't work, you're looking at a potential constructive dispute.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If an employer was to, decide, sort of go against that, I mean, obviously the recommendation or the guidance that you've laid out is that there's these significant hurdles to that to this. But if someone was really set on mandating immunization for existing employees, are there anything that they could do to sort of minimize the likelihood that the policy would be challenged, I guess, either by in a human rights context or in another legal context?
Yeah, absolutely. So to minimize the likelihood of a challenge of an immunization policy, there are a few steps an employer should take. So number one, the employer should ensure the policy does not conflict with the applicable employment agreements that are in place or the collective agreements for those members that are unionized. Second, the policy requirements, for example, when vaccination must be completed and what documentary proof will be required, must be clear. Third, the policy must be non-disciplinary. So it must be clear that a failure to get vaccinated won't result in termination or other discipline. So vaccinate or terminate policies are generally unenforceable. And typically what you would see is an unpaid leave of absence, while the employee is waiting to get their vaccination or until they comply with the employer's policy. Fourth, accommodation for those who cannot be vaccinated due to medical or religious reasons must be built into the process, which is what Alanna was describing a few moments ago when she was speaking to the human rights considerations of vaccination and the requirement to accommodate in certain cases. And finally, the employer must be sure that employees are aware of the consequences of the breach of the policy. So what happens if I don't comply? So those are important elements to build into your policy.
Great, thank you, Sebastian. Now another question: if an employer require non-vaccinated employees to follow different or more stringent health and safety measures than vaccinated employees? Is that something that's possible, or yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something we've generally been advising employers that they can do to protect their workforce. I think the nuance here that's important is to make sure it's not something that's punitive. You want to make sure it's additional measures that are geared towards health and safety and that are based in science. So for example, having unvaccinated employees wear some kind of identification on them that says, I'm not vaccinated. That would just serve to shame them, that would be punitive, and that wouldn't do anything to enhance health and safety. On the other hand, proven health and safety measures like continuing to wear masks, continuing to have social distancing, even after perhaps local bylaws are no longer requiring that, that would make sense to enhance health and safety for those unvaccinated employees. And even something that we're seeing a lot of employers do, and something that I would suggest is a good approach, is having a policy that requires employees who aren't vaccinated that they may be placed on a leave of absence if there were to be an outbreak of COVID-19 in the workforce, in the workplace rather. I think that can be really beneficial for employers to continue to protect health and safety for all employees.
Great, yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned there was mention of privacy considerations and how they play into this issue. Would you mind sort of outlining, what privacy considerations are at play here with the immunization?
Yeah, absolutely. So privacy issues arise anytime you ask employees for proof of vaccination, whether you have mandated vaccination or just want to know who may need extra protective measures during a COVID-19 outbreak. So that's the first thing. Second, when asking for such information, employers should comply with general privacy principles. And typically, this means that employers should ensure that any personal medical information collected from employees is directly related to and necessary for the achievement of their policy goals, i.e. ensuring workplace health and safety. So that has to be the primary and only goal. And the collection of employee personal information should also be as limited as possible. For example, employers should limit the data collected to confirmation that the employee has received either a first or a second dose of a vaccine and the date on which it was received, as opposed to also collecting the vaccine brand, the vaccine's brand name, the location of immunization, and so on and so forth, which is irrelevant in the circumstance. All you need to know is, has the person been vaccinated? Have they received 1 or 2 doses? And that's it. And finally, all personal information collected should be safeguarded and protected from unnecessary disclosure and shared only on a need-to-know basis. So those are important privacy principles as you're navigating through this process.
Great, thank you. Now I want to ask about new hires. Is it possible for an employer to make vaccination a condition when they hire a new employee?
Yeah, I would say it's certainly possible, but it's not without risk. So typically when you have a new hire, that's when you have the most leeway to decide what are going to be the terms and conditions of employment. And yet still with new hires, mandating immunizations can be risky. And so the first risk, again, I would go back to those human rights considerations. So say you have a candidate that applies for a job and you screen them out because they say they're not vaccinated. If it turns out that they're not vaccinated because of religion or disability or something that is a protected ground by human rights legislation, you're looking at a potential claim of discrimination on your refusal to have hired. So that can be kind of risky. The other thing I think is more of kind of a practical or optics concern. So usually when you'd ask an employee for medical information at the time of hire, you're doing that because it's a bona fide occupational requirement of the job. So you want to be able to say in good faith, someone needs to be vaccinated to do this job. But if you have existing employees in those same positions that are not vaccinated, and you're finding ways for them to work safely, such as masking, distancing, and what you've done throughout the pandemic to date, and then you've got a new hire and you're saying, oh, but for you to do this job, it's actually going to be, you're going to be required to be vaccinated. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. And that can create kind of a divide in the workforce depending on the time that you hire. So that's another consideration as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess the next question was, and you touched on it a little bit, I think, but if an employer does decide to go that route and make it a condition of hire, what are some risk mitigation strategies that they could enact?
Yeah, so some advice on that. So clearly indicating in all job postings that new employees will be required to show proof of COVID-19 vaccination upon being offered the job, but that the employer undertakes to accommodate where necessary. For example, if they cannot be vaccinated due to a ground protected or protected ground under the Ontario Human Rights Code. So, one of the prohibited grounds of discrimination, and in our case, would either be on a religious consideration or due to a disability. And second, candidates should not be asked during the interview process about their immunization status or plans, lest the question unintentionally would out the fact that they cannot be vaccinated due to a protected ground by the human rights legislation. So it's really important when conducting these interviews to be careful in how the questions are being asked. You want to assess the candidate based on an objective assessment of their ability and suitability to do the job. And then once an assessment has been conducted about the suitability of the candidate and as part of a conditionally offered position, then you can say, as we want confirmation that you've been vaccinated. So typically that's the kind of the two-step process: interview, offer the position, but as one of the conditions or for hire, they must provide proof of vaccination. And at that point, you're able to show that you've assessed the candidate based on their skills and ability, and not weeded out the candidate based on the fact that they have not secured a vaccine, whether the first dose or the second dose, or both. And finally, the job offer itself should clearly state that if the candidate cannot receive a COVID-19 vaccine for human rights related reasons, they must advise the employer so that the employer can discuss appropriate accommodation measures with them. So, again, a flexible approach, and which is required. But to answer your main question is it possible? Yes, but the employers must sort of ensure that they're flexible in their approach, because human rights considerations will arise. Some may be legitimate, some may not, but it's important to keep an open mind when addressing these issues. So,
yeah, absolutely. I think we've covered many of the main points of interest on this topic. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to add, or is that a decent overview, I guess? Of course, it's not going to cover every nuance and issue, but a little bit of an overview to provide business owners, employers with some information on this topic. Is there anything that we didn't touch on?
I think it does provide a good overview of some of the important legal considerations, and I think the other aspect as well is that things will evolve, right? COVID-19 is I don't know, people don't like this word, but unprecedented. We're needed to be sort of agile and be able to adapt and change our way of thinking and our way of addressing issues. And the science will also be important as we navigate through, or we come out of COVID-19 And so the approaches are going to change, and the public health considerations are going to change as well. And hopefully we don't need to talk about COVID-19 in a few months from now, but I think it's important for employers to keep an open mind and where necessary, and if they feel appropriate, of course, to seek out advice from their legal counsel. So,
absolutely. Well, I really appreciate it, both Sebastian and Alanna taking the time to discuss this really important topic. I know our members are definitely seeking information on this, and as you say, if they have some more specific questions, to definitely reach out to legal professionals in that area of law. So thank you very much. Your time was really appreciated. We can leave it there.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting Alanna and I to speak on this issue. Appreciate it.